Anselm presents a thought-provoking a priori deductive proof for the existence of God, beginning with a definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Surprisingly, Anselm argues that even atheists, who deny the existence of God, must have some level of understanding of this divine concept. According to Anselm, one cannot deny something without first comprehending its essence. To further his argument, Anselm distinguishes between two types of existence: existence in reality, and existence in intellectu, in the mind. Drawing on his definition of God, Anselm asserts that it is greater for God to exist in both reality and the mind. In other words, if God were to exist solely in the mind but not in reality, a greater being could be conceived, which contradicts the initial definition of God. Consequently, Anselm reaches the conclusion that God must exist in reality. He posits that those who claim there is no God, whom he refers to as fools, are making a contradictory statement. According to Anselm, by definition, that which nothing greater can be conceived must exist, and therefore, the denial of God's existence contradicts the very nature of God. Through this deductive reasoning, Anselm challenges individuals to contemplate the existence of God and urges them to confront any inherent contradictions within their beliefs. By delving into the depths of our understanding, we are invited to explore the profound possibilities that lie beyond our limited comprehension. In response to Anselm's a priori deductive proof for the existence of God, Gaunilo, a contemporary of Anselm, presents a thought-provoking counter-argument. Gaunilo suggests that Anselm's reasoning can be used to prove the existence of anything, leading him to propose the concept of the greatest island. According to Gaunilo, the greatest island is defined as the island than which no greater can be conceived. Using Anselm's line of reasoning, Gaunilo asserts that it is greater for the greatest island to exist in reality rather than merely in the mind. By analogy, if the greatest island does not exist, one could conceive of an even greater island, leading to the conclusion that the greatest island must exist in reality. However, Gaunilo playfully acknowledges that the greatness of this island might be diminished if there happened to be a giant dead monk in the background. Gaunilo highlights the limitation of relying solely on AI image generators, which may not always provide accurate representations. Gaunilo's example of the greatest island serves as a clever counter-argument to Anselm's reasoning. It challenges the validity of the original proof by demonstrating that the same line of thinking could lead to seemingly absurd conclusions if applied without careful consideration. Gaunilo's critique encourages a deeper examination of the logic employed in Anselm's proof and urges us to question whether it truly establishes the existence of God or if it can inadvertently lead to illogical outcomes when applied to other scenarios. Anselm, in defense of his argument, introduces a distinction between contingent and necessary existence. He posits that God, as the concept of that than which nothing greater can be conceived, would be even greater if God existed necessarily. Anselm argues that when we contemplate God, we inherently perceive him as a necessary being, one that cannot fail to exist. He goes further to suggest that even atheists, in their theoretical understanding, would agree with this notion, albeit denying it in reality. Anselm then draws a comparison to the example of the greatest island to highlight the distinction between contingent and necessary existence. While we can conceive of the greatest island not existing, implying that its existence is contingent, Anselm asserts that by the very definition of God, God must possess necessary existence. Anselm's argument emphasizes that God, being the greatest conceivable being, cannot be subject to the limitations of contingent existence. If God's existence were contingent, it would imply the possibility of conceiving a greater being, one that exists necessarily. This would contradict the fundamental definition of God. By presenting the contrast between contingent existence and the necessary existence associated with the concept of God, Anselm underscores the inherent quality of God's necessary existence. He challenges us to acknowledge that if God is truly that which nothing greater can be conceived, then his existence must be necessary and cannot be contingent upon anything else. Anselm's exploration of contingent and necessary existence invites us to reflect on the nature of God and the logical implications of his definition. It prompts us to delve into the intricacies of existence and consider the profound implications of necessary being. Through this philosophical journey, we are encouraged to contemplate the limits of contingent existence and explore the transcendent concept of God's necessary existence. John Wisdom introduced a thought-provoking parable known as the parable of the invisible gardener. In this parable, two men, man 1 and man 2, stumble upon what appears to be a well-tended garden. Man 1 concludes that a gardener must be responsible for its maintenance, while man 2 finds no evidence of such a gardener despite his diligent search, including setting up traps in the garden. Consequently, man 2 concludes that there is no gardener. To strengthen his argument, man 1 introduces the notion that the gardener must be invisible and intangible, making it impossible to directly perceive or catch the gardener. This clarification is intended to address the absence of any observable evidence for the gardener's existence. However, Antony Flew characterizes this line of reasoning as dying the death of 1,000 qualifications. He argues that by excessively qualifying and modifying their original argument, proponents render it unrecognizable and significantly different from its initial form. Flew's critique of the parable of the invisible gardener extends beyond its specific context. He suggests that definitions of God often suffer from the same fate, becoming unfalsifiable due to constant modifications and qualifications. As criticisms are raised against these definitions, they are repeatedly adjusted and refined, gradually losing their original coherence and meaning. This argument can be effectively applied to Anselm's definition of God. In fact, Anselm himself seems to engage in the process of qualifying his definition when responding to Gonillo's criticism. This observation further highlights the tendency for definitions of God to evolve through extensive qualifications in order to withstand criticism. Through the parable of the invisible gardener and its implications for the definitions of God, philosophers are prompted to critically examine the process of qualification and modification in philosophical arguments. It encourages us to consider the impact of continuous adjustments on the integrity and coherence of these arguments. Ultimately, by recognizing the potential pitfalls of qualifying arguments, we can strive to maintain the clarity and coherence of our philosophical discourse. Through thoughtful analysis and reflection, we can ensure that our arguments remain true to their original intent, fostering meaningful and productive intellectual exchanges. Descartes embarks on a philosophical journey by defining God as the supremely perfect being. He asserts that this divine entity must possess all attributes or predicates of perfection. To illustrate his point, Descartes draws a parallel to a triangle, a shape with necessary qualities such as 3 sides and 3 angles summing up to 180 degrees. Just as a shape would cease to be a triangle if it lacked these essential characteristics, a being would not be God if it did not possess its perfect qualities. In his quest to establish the existence of God, Descartes introduces the notion that existence itself is a perfection. This leads him to argue that it is illogical to claim that the supremely perfect being would lack the perfection of existence. In other words, if we conceive of God as the embodiment of perfection, it follows that God must possess the attribute of existence, as existence is an inherent part of perfection. Descartes' reasoning is rooted in the idea that perfection encompasses all conceivable perfections, and existence is a fundamental element of this concept. By establishing existence as a predicate of perfection, Descartes strengthens his argument for the existence of a supremely perfect being, which he identifies as God. Through his analogy of the triangle and his assertion that existence is a perfection, Descartes presents a logical and rational case for the existence of God. He invites us to explore the nature of perfection, drawing connections between necessary qualities and the divine attributes of a supremely perfect being. By delving into these philosophical depths, Descartes challenges us to contemplate the intricate interplay between existence and perfection, and to consider the implications of these ideas on our understanding of God. In the realm of philosophical discourse, Descartes' reasoning serves as a testament to the power of logical deduction and conceptual exploration. It encourages us to critically examine our notions of perfection and existence, paving the way for deeper insights into the nature of the divine. Kant challenges the ontological argument by asserting that it erroneously treats existence as a predicate. He argues that a predicate must contribute new information to our understanding of the subject it is applied to, and existence does not fulfill this criterion. Therefore, according to Kant, existence cannot function as a predicate. Instead, Kant posits that existence is the precondition for a subject to possess predicates. It is not a characteristic or quality that adds to the subject's attributes. Kant's perspective undermines the ontological arguments put forth by Anselm and Descartes, as these arguments rely on viewing existence as a perfection or a property that enhances greatness. Kant further develops his position by asserting that existential propositions cannot be purely analytic. They are always synthetic. In contrast, the ontological argument assumes that the statement God exists is an analytic proposition, which means its truth can be determined through analysis of concepts. Kant challenges this assumption, maintaining that such a statement can only be synthetic, requiring empirical evidence or experience to establish its truth. As a result, Kant concludes that the ontological argument fails. In essence, Kant's critique of the ontological argument centers on the distinction between existence as a predicate and existence as a precondition, as well as the nature of existential propositions. By highlighting the limitations of treating existence as a predicate and the synthetic nature of existential statements, Kant challenges the logical foundation of the ontological argument and calls into question its validity. Kant asserts that if the predicate is included in the definition of a subject, contradicting that predicate will lead to a logical contradiction. For instance, calling a bachelor a married man contradicts the predicate of being unmarried, resulting in an inconsistency. However, Kant argues that this approach does not apply to the ontological argument. As he previously established, existence is not a predicate of God. Therefore, asserting God does not exist does not generate any contradictory claims, since existence is not part of the definition or predicate of God. To further illustrate this point, Kant employs Descartes' example of a triangle. While it would be illogical to deny that a triangle has three internal angles summing up to 180 degrees, it is not illogical to claim that a triangle, and thus its internal angles, does not exist. In essence, denying the existence of triangles does not contradict the definition of a triangle itself. In summary, Kant highlights that the denial of existence does not create a logical contradiction when it comes to predicates included in definitions. This reasoning applies to the ontological argument as well, as the assertion of non-existence for God does not contradict the definition of God. By emphasizing the distinction between denying predicates and denying existence, Kant challenges the validity of claims that deny the existence of entities without contradicting their definitions. Applying Wittgenstein's theory of language games leads to two distinct arguments with regards to the ontological argument. Both non-cognitivists and cognitivists utilize Wittgenstein's theory in different ways. Cognitivists assert that since the ontological argument operates within the realm of religious language games, it holds meaning and significance for those who are engaged in that specific religious context. From their perspective, the argument has validity within its own religious framework. On the other hand, non-cognitivists present a counter-argument by highlighting that the ontological argument also makes an existential proposition, addressing the question of whether something exists in reality. They argue that this places the ontological argument within the domain of scientific language games. From this standpoint, the argument fails because it cannot be verified or falsified through empirical evidence or scientific methodology. Furthermore, from an empiricist perspective influenced by thinkers like Hume, it is argued that human understanding is limited to the realm of the observable and experiential. According to this view, concepts that go beyond the confines of the mundane system are deemed faulty or beyond our comprehension. In relation to Anselm's definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, this perspective suggests that our cognitive limitations prevent us from conceiving such a notion. In summary, the application of Wittgenstein's theory of language games yields contrasting arguments. Cognitivists emphasize the significance of the ontological argument within religious language games, while non-cognitivists challenge its validity by placing it within the scientific language game. Additionally, an empiricist perspective raises concerns about our ability to conceive concepts that extend beyond our experiential understanding. These varying perspectives contribute to the ongoing discourse surrounding the ontological argument and its implications.